forward. So
I'm starting the live now, just so you know. Let's see, it's charging. There. Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the subject of AVs Hot Topics, the best practices to mitigate legal risks. And our moderators of today are Charlotte Roux, who is a senior associate at Hogan Lovells. And we will also be moderated by Sebastian Polly, who's a partner in industry sector co-head, also at Hogan Lovells. So Charlotte and Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the kind words and for having us. A big hello to everybody who is joining us today. And if we could jump to the next slide, and I would quickly like, together with Charlotte, to introduce the team we're having here for you. First of all, I'd like to introduce Hans Steege, who is from Volkswagen AG. He's from the Public Affairs Department, and also Jessica Uguccioni, who is the lead lawyer for automated vehicle review and a member of Law Commission of England and Wales, based in London. And then without further ado, I don't know, Jessica, do you want to say a sentence or two about yourself so that people can put things into a little bit more context? And by the way, during the prep session, Jessica has a cat, and the cat likes to appear. So watch closely and pay attention. Maybe you see the cat, but only maybe. So Jessica, over to you.
Now we've got people's attention. Yeah, I actually have two cats, so I'm raising the stakes there, Sebastian. Yes, my name is Jessica Uguccioni, and as you mentioned, I'm with the Law Commission, which doesn't have quite as much I guess, international recognition as Volkswagen. So it makes sense for me to explain what my organization does. So we are supporting the UK government in developing legislation for self-driving cars. So it's a very specific project on automation. We started it in 2018. And as part of that work, I've been involved, obviously, dealing with the Department for Transport and developing policy and a lot of consultation with people both and organizations within the UK, but also internationally. So we had the pleasure of having a lot of input across the piece from safety organizations as well as industry players and that kind of aspect, as well as some international organizations as the UN. So I'm a member of the informal group of experts at the United Nations on Working Party 1, which is specifically about the way that we should be evolving road traffic regulation in the context of international conventions and user behavior. So that's our main focus there. But yeah, that's all from me from now.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Hans, over to you. What is there that we should know about you, what you're doing for Volkswagen? And also, I know you're also working in this field from an academic perspective. Do you want to give people a little bit of a context about who you are?
So at first, hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this interesting panel. And I'm very happy to discuss with you the AVs topics. So I studied law in the University of Hanover in Germany. I'm writing on my PhD thesis in liability law, and I have a very strong focus, and I'm very interested in all the fields of automation, digitalization, of autonomous vehicles. And I'm doing, besides my work at Volkswagen, where I'm covering the aspects data protection, AI, and AVs. From a legal perspective, I'm having some legal research I'm doing in these fields too, and I'm since this year also co-editoring a new journal, a law journal for the law of the digital economy, and a book on AI. So these are my parts of interest, both on the job side and on the private side. So yes.
Hans, thank you so much. And once again, Jessica, Hans, thank you so much for joining our illustrious panel here. Charlotte, over to you. Do you want to say a sentence or two about who you are and what your special focus is? And by the way, Charlotte's one of the stars in our automotive team.
Thank you. So I'm a senior associate in Paris office. I'm on the SOAR team, so it's strategic, operational, regulatory, and agreements. In short, to say that I'm mainly working in regulatory and commercial on commercial topics, and having a strong focus on automotive, mobility, and telecommunications. And I would say that I'm working a lot for all the questions surrounding AVs, especially that now we have a new beginning of framework in France for that. So, so I'm really happy to be here. part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Then I would say let's dive right into the topic. So I'd say ladies first. So Jessica, that's all right with you. You already started talking a little bit about Working Party 1 and what's happening. Do you just want to give us, a recent idea in terms of lawmaking trends, what you're seeing in the AV Hot Topics space? What's happening there?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening, as you said. I think probably the biggest trend that I see is now currently taking shape within regulation is the distinction between vehicles that issue transition demands, where you're basically sharing the driving task across time. So the vehicle is driving itself, but only for a portion of a trip. And in order to complete a journey, you're still relying on a driver to take over. So there's quite a lot of focus on how you regulate that transition, make sure it's safe. How long does it take? And what kinds of activities are going to allow the user of that vehicle, which is in many jurisdictions, they are still referred to as a driver, but they're not driving for part of the journey. And that causes some tensions. And as Charlotte was saying, it's really interesting to see the developments in France about the criminal liability in those situations. So it'll be great to talk about that later. So I think that's like a major area of focus. Including at the UN level. So there's a resolution that's been in the works for some years now. It's been about 3 years that people in the informal group of experts at a UN level have been thinking about the other activities than driving, basically, that could be allowable. And we have great hopes that it might be adopted in the next session in September. So that we'll have a resolution about that, which can help harmonization across different jurisdictions. And of course, the counterpart to that is the other type of automated vehicle, which is vehicles which can complete a journey, and they might be the ones that more strike our imagination. You can imagine people that can't currently drive can just get on board, a bit like our ride-hailing services today, but instead of having a human driving us around, it would be, well, an empty seat, or you could a notional robot driver. So that's one aspect. And again, we're seeing evolutions there. Again, the French draft talks about that, also in Germany, and Hans will tell us a bit more about that later. The L4 law in Germany is considering that aspect. And we're seeing the European Commission, their motor vehicle working group, also considering the use case of low-speed shuttles and how that will be implemented in terms of type approvals that are specific to ADS. And just something that I've noticed, which I found really interesting, is also the evolution of how we think about safety in regulation. And this safety metrics are still evolving. And one that I'm seeing more and more in research is this time to collision as a way of thinking about how we can bridge that gap between our understanding of what safe driving is in a more semantic, human way of a careful and competent driver. How do we translate that to an algorithm that needs mathematical models, more consistency? And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking at the buffer around the vehicle of safety in regulation. So those are things that I think are, very interesting and emerging more.
Jessica, thank you so much. And that was already a lot of insights and a lot of topics. Let me just pick one directly up. That was the point of the transition time. And I think you already mentioned Charlotte, who is French-based and from a French perspective, and particularly, I think, from a criminal law perspective. But of course, Charlotte, feel free to pick whatever you want to kind of give us a little bit of an idea what's happening there. What's the driver? What's keeping you busy at night?
Night and day. Sure. One thing that is interesting, and Jessica mentioned, is all about the driver, the notion of the driver. And I don't know, Jessica, if you were mentioning the amendment of the Vienna Convention that is about to be adopted by the member states. But this is the amendment where it's mentioned that is the requirement of having a driver is deemed satisfied once you have the technical regulation in place. So to me, this was quite key in terms of evolving through the notion of driver, because this notion of driver in France is still part of the regulation, the new regulation that was adopted on the 14th of April. So we still have a driver in France, and the driver has to keep control as well. So this was quite key to see that once at all times. So we have in France a general regime for all delegated driving vehicles. Yeah, we have this fashion word for France. So we don't speak about automated vehicle, but delegated driving vehicle. And we have so the general regime for that, and we have also a specific regime for automated road transport systems. So if I have to define it as more public transport systems that will be put in place. And so we still have the notion of driver, and the driver can be only for this specific regime, public transport, can be remote. And so there we still struggle to understand when the driver is remote. Should we consider, is it a remote driver? Is it really a driver? We have this notion that is derived from the international framework, which we have remote assistance, remote driving. What does it mean? So this is quite key. In France, what I can say is that for the general regime, the driver cannot be remote. The driver has to be inside the car. So we were quite sad when we saw this, because we thought that we're going to take a huge step for that. And if we just directly step in the liability regime, this regulation provides that the driver of a vehicle, which driving functions are delegated to an automated driving system, should not be held criminally liable for the offenses committed when the automated driving holds the dynamic control of the vehicle. There are some exceptions to that, but when the ADS is on, it's the car manufacturer, the vehicle manufacturer, and not the ADS. So the regulation specify that is the vehicle manufacturer in charge of the type approval that is liable for that. And when I say that it suffers from exceptions, so we have few exceptions, notably when the driver does not regain control of the vehicle after being requested to do so. So Jessica, when you were saying about requesting control, we have under the French law now, a kind of a period when the ADS requires the driver to regain control. And this period will be defined by other regulations, but so we're still waiting for that. So at this stage, we have one of this exception where the vehicle manufacturer won't be held liable in case of an accident. And another exception is when the driver does not comply with injunctions given by law enforcement authorities. So this is one big takeaway in terms of liability. So it's either the vehicle manufacturer, either the driver. And one also important takeaway from this regulation is that it is imposing on the ADS to request the driver, it is imposing the ADS to request the driver to take back control. So it kind of gives the requirements, well, in terms of level. And when we analyze that, and I know that there's many discrepancies in analyzing whether it is level 4, level 3, but in our opinion, when the ADS is required to ask the driver to intervene, we are more into a level 3. So it was quite upsetting to see that the French regulations for the general regime only regulates the level 3, but this is where we are in France at this stage.
Thank you, Charlotte. So there was another cue. You just said level 3, so that automatically brings me to level 4. We heard a lot about criminal liability. Let's maybe talk a little bit about civil liability or traditional product liability. And I think, Hans, you're one of the perfect persons in this environment to give us some insight how you feel about all these developments and what you think are hot topics and things that people should have in the back of their head.
Yeah, so I think very interesting data protection issues which come along with recording also the passengers in the cars, but also the whole environment like pedestrians, bywalkers, other cars and streets and buildings. So we also have some copyright issues in some countries because buildings can be protected under copyright there. And I think another very hot topic is from a civil liability basis or point of view, the time to take over the action from the SA3 level system car for the human driver and to fully comply with then the obligations he have. And I think very interesting is also the aspect if, besides the GDPR, the product liability directive is fit enough for software, AI, and AVs. So I think these are 3 areas where you can check if the existing laws are really fit enough for this, yeah, like future time or for the digital time, you can say.
Let me just challenge that one for a second. So when you say, for example, the PLD, the Product Liability Directive, is it fit enough? I mean, it's been with us for many years, and I'd say it's been a very balanced companion for both sides. I mean, you've got the claimants, you've got the defendants, but I think there's always been this consensus. The aim is a perfect balance, you know, not to shift too much in one or the other direction. How do you feel at the moment? Do we need to change much? If so, what might require changes to ensure that we keep this balance?
Yeah, so there's an existing debate in the legal field if the PLD is fit enough with a focus on software, because when you just speak about AVs, you will say they definitely fall under the scope of the PLD, but there's a distinction or discussion for software, because in Article 2 of the PLD, it says that product means all movables, even if incorporated into another movable, or if it's an immovable, including electricity. And so there's a legal debate discussing if software is a movable, because it's not a physical good, but in the end you would say, yes, it falls under the PLD, it's under the scope, or in the scope. And I think personally, it's really enough if lawmakers would clarify these points, like software falls under the scope, software is a product, and we should not touch the, as you mentioned, the effective and well-balanced liability system we have, because if we touch it in a wrong way, we have negative effects on the development of new technologies, and we have restraints for the producer if there's a high risk to develop new technologies and to put things into the market. So I think we should not touch this well-balanced and traditioned liability regime, but the lawmakers could clarify some points to avoid legal discussions if software, for example, falls under the scope as a product. So
thank you so much, Hans. Those were very helpful insights. I mean, maybe Jessica, again, over to you. There is always this debate, and Hans already kind of framed it a little bit, like how safe is safe enough? You know, on the one hand, I think it's fair to say that maybe not everybody, but a vast majority wants AVs on the roads. Of course, the manufacturers want them, but you also said, I mean, depending on what kind of AV, it'll change people's lives, the lives of people who can't drive in the first place, but also the lives of those who might just, you know, change the experience of getting from A to B. And I mean, everything like Hans just said, I mean, there's got to be a certain balance, and there might also be certain things that limit people from entering the AV sphere too early, maybe therefore too late. How do you feel about how safe is safe enough? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a really important threshold question. You know, when are we going to be allowing them on the roads? People don't want to feel like we're doing an experiment with actually people's lives, you know, around us. So that's something, you know, we consulted on these issues throughout the years. We've done different consultations, and I was reviewing the comments we've been getting in, and people feel very, very strongly that you should only allow automated vehicles on the road when they are quote unquote safe. But then again, that begs the question of what that means, and you have to balance it against the cost of not introducing them as well. So one of the big and dominant views that sort of comes across in regulation and discussions is this positive risk balance, which the sort of Safety First consortium of manufacturers has put forward. And it's reflected in the discussions that it has to outperform the average driver. But then again, what does the average driver mean? Average drivers are different in different jurisdictions. Certainly our rate of fatalities is different in different countries. I was actually really struck with the whole conversations about vaccines, because I think that really illustrates how a similar technology, you know, the names are the same across different jurisdictions, but the approaches are vastly different. Just to mention, you know, AstraZeneca, you know, I'm Italian, and it's a bit disconcerting to me that in Italy, for example, that vaccine is not allowed for people that are below sort of the age of 60, but say in the UK, it is permitted, you know, for use, in that sort of age group. And I think with AVs, we're going to be seeing very similar differences potentially, same technology, but different appetites for risk. And I think that's going to be quite difficult to encapsulate. And I think one of the topics that we've been pressed by industry as well is that they want more of an input from regulators to tell them, what do you want? So we can meet that requirement and then we can mitigate our risk, because we don't want to have to make the call about what's safe enough. You should tell us. And then on the other hand, the regulators are basically saying, well, we've not dealt with this technology before. You're never going to see a politician sit up and say this number of deaths is acceptable. It's just not viable as an ask. So, and that's not how we've done it so far. So there's this real gap between expectations and what people want from each other. And I think one of the key things is really helping facilitate that conversation and making it more transparent. So if we are comparing to average drivers, for example, if we think that's the parameter, how much better does it have to be? Because you're already saving lives, but there's going to be an order of magnitude that people expect. You might say that you shouldn't be comparing someone to, a current young drunk driver, for example. Just outperforming them shouldn't really be good enough. But on the other hand, you are saving a life. And I remember when I first started this project, it was like back, I think even 2017, I heard a really powerful speech by a mother of a child that had lost their life, through drunk driving. And like, no mother should go through that again. And if AVs can help that, we should take that into account. So you shouldn't discount those deaths. So I think it's a really difficult debate. And I think more transparency and not making assumptions about what it is that we're doing is important. And if we are making assumptions, I think we need to be very open about what we're saying, because I think people are coming at it from very different perspectives. Certainly the insurers, for example, that we've been speaking with, said the only acceptable comparison is with a competent and careful driver that is driving the top-notch vehicle, with the Euro NCAP top rating. That is your comparator, not the average driver that might be also driving a much older vehicle or not be paying attention. These things make a massive difference. And unless we are clear about how we navigate that difference, I think we're going to be having we're not going to be understanding each other, and the debate is not going to be informed. So I think that's one of the really interesting parts I think we can improve and make a difference in, just being more transparent and really teasing out these differences.
That is extremely helpful, Jessica, particularly when you kind of described how we're kind of going in circles. Like everybody wants kind of guidance from the regulators. They're kind of like, how should we know? So thank you for that insight. On the other hand, you've mentioned the average driver a couple of times, and I don't know if that number is correct. I'm just saying it out loud now, but don't quote me on that one. If you ask everybody out there, do you think you're an above or below average driver? Then around 80% of people will say I'm above average. So whatever that means, it basically says that at least 30%, assuming the number is right, 30% are unaware of the fact that they are in fact under average drivers, and the next 50% are in fact under average drivers. So it's kind of tricky where you go with that, right? So I'm kind of wondering, maybe going back, we just talked a bit about safety, talking about liability. I don't know, Hans, how do you feel about that? Is it maybe from a company perspective, is it the idea to say, look, we're as good as the average, that's enough for us? And don't get me wrong, I might be the average. I would basically maybe hope the car's driving better than I am. I don't know, just making this up now. How do you feel about that, Hans?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and quite a bit of mean question, because when I think for every new technology, and Jessica mentioned it for the vaccine, so when we see we have big potentials and big chances for AVs, like giving mobility for elderly people, for people with several restrictions, we have a big chance to reduce accidents. So like nearly 80% of the accidents in road traffic are due to the human driver, and we can reduce this because the systems, or the AV systems, will always be aware of the situation in the streets, will always focus on the streets. The system will never be drunk or under drugs, something like this. And I think the comparison is, if I would come up with an invention telling people I developed a new technology, naming it a conventional car, and telling the people there will be only in Germany 2,000 deaths a year, plus hundreds of accidents and injured people. So I think everyone would say, phew, we would stay to horses, we won't have this technology. And now we have the chance to improve the safety of the roads. And I think that's quite a tricky question to then say, oh, what safe is, or how safe is safe enough? Because as Jessica mentioned, in every different jurisdiction, the level of obligations for the human driver differs. So in Germany, it may be stronger and stricter what the perfect driver is and what is the perfect driver, as you mentioned, Sebastian. So I think like the German Federal Court always states in product liability aspects, there's always a risk at life. So there's no technology and also no life with no risk. So when I go outside my home, there can be like a tree falling on me, and there can be some mistakes. But I think in general, we should see the technology as bringing fewer accidents to the road and save people's lives, and bring so many chances to the people using AVs and to the people participating in the traffic system.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hans, for that insight, and that kind of also resonates with me. Where what my big takeaway now is, if somebody would reinvent the car right now, they'd be burning probably, because people would tell them like, look, that's too dangerous. We should stick to horses. That was one of my major takeaways. And
can I come in on that?
Oh, jump. Yeah, sure. Jump right in, Jessica.
I feel like I want to come in defense of the driver, the human, because I feel like humans get such a bad rep, but we're actually pretty amazing in like also what we achieve. And we do move people around, and all the statistics about all the incidents that drivers cause, you always blame the human. You know, even if it was a rainy day, or if the speed limit might have maybe not been so appropriate for that road, there are questions about what the right speed limits are. You know, people are changing them. It's not like a fact, like a ground truth on that. And you always somehow blame the human in the vehicle, because they're the last point in the chain of causation, and they always get blamed. And I was like very struck also by what Charlotte was saying about the French reforms, which actually also mirror a lot in the German 2017 amendment as well. You know, these references to the driver and their interaction with the automated driving system, we're basically still relying on the driver to do all the hardest parts about the driving. So the ADS is meaningfully driving itself for some of the journey, but for example, responding to an emergency vehicle, or some of the things that we worried about in the UK as well, which came up in respect of automated lane keeping systems, is this whole question of low energy collisions. Because if you're telling someone in the car that they don't have to be paying attention, and imagine that there's like a low energy collision, it could be a brush with a motorcycle, or maybe it could be a pothole. And if you're looking the other way, you won't necessarily know the difference from the inside. So how can we make sure that we're reporting incidents and stopping for those things? So the responsibility for stopping, as I understand from also the French regulations, is on the human, you know, to stop in case that there's an incident. But if you're also telling them that they cannot pay attention, then it becomes problematic to make sure that we're actually appropriately dealing with these situations. And that's been like a major concern when we've been looking at this area, is really trying to demarcate the responsibilities of the human, what you can reasonably expect, from that of the system. So you shouldn't be, at least according to what we're suggesting in our reforms, and the consultations have supported that in the UK, and for Great Britain roads, is the idea that you should not be expecting the human to notice that there is a police car that's trying to pull you over, or the vehicle itself has to be able to detect that, you know, if it's conducting the dynamic driving. Similar with low energy collisions, it should be the vehicle that stops. The human has other responsibilities, but the actual dynamic elements should be very clearly with the vehicle. And so one of the big differences, as I see, what we're suggesting in the UK versus what I've seen in other jurisdictions, is we think you should only expect the human to respond to a transition demand, but nothing else. So if there's something external, you shouldn't be relying on the human to just themselves intervene, because also bad interventions are probably the most dangerous thing. You need to be trusting this ADS to do its job. And if you intervene without a transition demand because you think, oh, the ADS can't deal, maybe the ADS hasn't seen that child, you might do something that's much more dangerous. You might swerve when you really shouldn't. So I'm this whole blame the human and keeping the driver still having to pay attention all the time is asking the impossible, I think, of humans. Like we just are not able to do it. And I'm worried that there's more of that element, still it's driving itself, but we also want the human to be on the hook all the time. And I think we need to be a bit more clear in splitting those up.
Perfect, Jessica. Thank you so much for that. Just to give the audience an idea, we have another 10 minutes left and we got a lot of questions. So we're trying to make you guys as happy as we can in those last 10 minutes. And one of the questions was built around MaaS and mobility as a service. So the question is maybe to Hans, what do you think when people talk about MaaS? Is that a viable business model for a car OEM? Is that what people are looking into right now? Or is it just going a completely wrong direction? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so MaaS and TaaS, especially for light commercial vehicles, so Volkswagen commercial vehicles producers, so it's a very hot topic. So like you said, MaaS is mobility as a service and TaaS would be transport as a service where we would move goods. And the idea is to have like a robo-taxi, robo-vans, and we think that they have great importance because to bring mobility to people, to add new mobility in cities, to add new mobility to like land regions. So I think there's a big business case behind it for providing mobility aspects or mobility to people who have not this much mobility in their city or at several times in the city. So I think that's a big topic. And also moving goods with like transport as a service. When you have a business, you need some goods and you have an autonomous vehicle with an SAE level 4 and it brings you some goods to your shop, to your house. So there are lots of things you can think of.
Love it. Let me maybe challenge that for one more second, because just to put things into perspective, I mean, when we talk about MaaS and TaaS, I mean, back in the old days, and maybe still currently, I think it's fair to say, I mean, companies generate revenue by selling the actual product. Going away from this idea, you'd say, look, it's not so much about buying or renting or whatever a car, it's about getting from A to B. We either offer mobility to people, or we transport goods. So MaaS, TaaS. How do people make money then? Is that a reliable business? Is that better than selling cars? And maybe because we know you're also deeply involved in data and the GDPR, I ask very blunt, I mean, where's the money coming from? Is it also the data? Are people looking into this? How can one monitorize the idea? Is it just getting from A to B, or what are companies looking into these days?
Yeah, so this is, like you already said, a very big field, because so as you might know, there are different layers. So we have the car producer, we have the operator providing some activities, and we can have some companies building like platforms, like apps. And there's a huge new business model arising, because on the one hand, you mentioned we have the people wanting their own car, their private owned car. On the other hand, we have people who live in big cities who say, I just want the mobility. It's enough for me to have a bicycle, to then use like MaaS service to get from A to B. And with these, new mobility aspects, I think a whole new market is coming up with several interesting aspects for car manufacturers, for operators, and I think we will have like a shift or something adding to the old version of just owning one private car and that's it. And so, as you mentioned, the GDPR is a real huge topic, not only for the data rising up in all these fields, but also for looking if the car is fully complied with the GDPR. And I think there's a big question if the GDPR is really fit enough for AVs, because when I look at the Article 6 of the GDPR with the lawfulness of processing, in number 1, we have from A to F several points like giving consent from the data subject, we have the performance of a contract, and so on. And I think the first 3 points may suit for the passengers in the car, but not for the environment outside of the car. So you could think of processing is necessary for the purpose of the legitimate interest, and then you have a big problem because you have to know who is the controller of the data. You then would look up where is the data stored, who has access to this, and that depends on the regulation or the legal framework. Is there an existing legal framework saying how to store and where to store the data? Is it missing at all? And with regard to the European court decisions, there's only really fast a joint controllership thinkable. And with this, there are several duties arising for companies as professional operators and also for private customers. So I think it's a really wide field, and coming up with the sentence that perhaps when you're driving a car and it's private owned and there's not a joint controllership, you could say that it's not in scope, because after Article 2, number 2, you have the processing of data by a natural person can be in the course of a purely and natural personal household activity. So this raises a question for commercial vehicles or professional operated vehicles that there could be no legal basis to collect and proceed the data. So I think this is a huge topic for having to mitigate legal risks, to clarify this in the GDPR.
Thank you, Hans. I mean, that was sort of the elephant in the room, but of course, I think it's I'm not sure if I'm supposed to call it a minefield, but data and GDPR and everything that's happening right now. I mean, it's good to know that you guys are looking into this, and maybe, you know, looking at data from another side now, just to make an even broader picture, draw an even broader picture from Hot Topics side. What about cybersecurity? And I know, Charlotte, you've been looking into cyber, and how do you feel about that from your perspective? That's a totally different angle to data. Let's talk about cybersecurity.
Sure. One thing is that the French framework is now providing for a new regime that will be applicable to delegated driving vehicles. And so it's slightly different. This regime will coexist with the GDPR regime because it's mainly refers to cyber attacks. We don't have the definition right now. There is no, it's just a provision in the regulation saying that the vehicle manufacturer must notify the car approval authority. So it's not really it's a new authority that will be in charge of that. And so they should notify without delay. So this framework will coexist with the GDPR framework once whenever personal data will be impacted. And I think it really and when we speak about data, just I just take 30 seconds, but we can see that not only autonomous, but when we speak about connected vehicles, data are really highly regulated. We have eCall regulation, we have CATS regulation, we have also the new recorder for autonomous vehicle regulation that will also come into force. We may have e-privacy when we have telecommunications services that will be involved inside the car. So it's really highly regulated, and it is really key to set like a board on all the regulation that will be applicable. And the French regime is also imposing new requirements in terms of the data that can be collected by the authority or not. So, and cyber gives another piece, and it's quite key to have a really big data strategy, and just not to fear everyone. But when we look at this regime, and we also have another regime which is for operators of essential services, and it might have, and this cybersecurity might also be applicable in some transport, public transport services. So we'll see that we're going to have many different cybersecurity regime that will coexist, and it feels like we are as regulated and even more than banking systems. So it's really key to take into account all the different frameworks, and I hope that the French won't be a specific one, and that all the other states will align to the French one.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And maybe we have another minute left just to make use of. Oh,
unfortunately, we do not. We have 30 seconds left. I'm sorry to cut everything so short.
No,
we are
no
on
worries.
a very pressed schedule.
No
but thank you so much for this very interesting discussion and a very important topic. And for everyone listening in, I wish you to stay tuned on Autonomy Digital for the rest of the program. And well, yeah, thank you for everyone present.
Pleasure so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.